In the spring of 1241, Europe stared into an abyss it barely understood. Smoke rose over the plains of Hungary, monasteries lay in ruins, and entire armies had vanished in a single day. At Legnica in Silesia, a coalition of knights from Poland, Bohemia, and the Teutonic Order had been shattered. At the Sarjo River, near a village called Mohi, the cream of the Hungarian kingdom had been crushed by an enemy that moved faster than any Christian commander could react. Refugees poured westward, bringing tales of riders who seemed to come from nowhere, encircle entire forces, and kill with terrifying efficiency before disappearing back into the steppe. Chroniclers reached for biblical language. These were the scourge of God, the people of Gog and Magog, a punishment unleashed at the end of days. From the vantage point of 1241, it was easy to believe that nothing stood between the Mongol armies and the Atlantic. The kingdoms of Poland and Hungary lay in ruins. The Holy Roman Empire was mired in a bitter conflict between Emperor Frederick II and the papacy. France and England were more focused on their own rivals than on some distant horseman. If you had asked a terrified burgher in Vienna or Nuremberg whether the invaders could conquer all of Europe, the answer would likely have been a horrified yes. Yet, that apocalyptic future never came. The Mongol main army turned back from the heart of Europe in 1242. Vienna, Prague, and the Rhine were never besieged. Paris, London, and Rome never saw Mongol standards fluttering over their walls. In later centuries, Europeans would build a different myth, that some miraculous stroke of fortune or some uniquely European virtue had saved the continent from certain conquest. Others, looking at the sheer scale of the Mongol Empire from Korea to the Carpathians, argued the opposite, that if not for one twist of fate, the riders from the east would have swept all the way to the ocean. So which is closer to the truth? Were the Mongols fully capable of conquering Europe but distracted by politics, or were there deeper constraints that made a full conquest unlikely from the start? To answer that, we have to strip away the drama and look at the problem the way a Mongol commander might have seen it in the mid-13th century. Imagine you are Batu, grandson of Genghis Khan, standing somewhere west of the Carpathians, surveying a devastated Hungarian plain. To your rear stretch thousands of kilometers of smashed cities and burned fields in Rus and the steppe zone. Ahead lies a patchwork of forested hills, stone-walled cities, and unfamiliar climates. You command some of the finest cavalry on earth, drilled in complex maneuvers, armed with powerful composite bows, and hardened by a decade of campaigns. But you also have limits. Your horses need pasture, your men need fodder, food, and rest. And your authority depends on a faraway imperial court now plunged into succession crisis. That combination military power that looks unstoppable on the battlefield, but runs into political, logistical, and ecological walls on the strategic level, is at the heart of why the Mongols did not go further. The popular story that they could have taken Europe but chose not to is only half right. They certainly had the capacity to devastate more territory and defeat more European field armies, at least in the short term. But conquest is not the same as raiding, and ruling Europe would have been a very different task than smashing through the open grasslands of the Rus' principalities or the irrigated cities of Central Asia. We also have to remember that the Mongol Empire, in the 1240s, was not a monolithic machine dedicated solely to European conquest. It was a world-spanning coalition of princely lineages, each with its own ambitions. China, the Islamic heartlands, Korea, and the rich trade routes of Central Asia all beckoned with far greater wealth than the timber towns of the north or the fragmented kingdoms of the Latin West. When we look back from Europe, it's easy to imagine that the fate of Christendom was the central question of the age. For the Mongol elite, Europe was one frontier among many, and not obviously the most rewarding. There's also the uncomfortable truth that Europe was not as helpless as frightened chroniclers made it sound. The early encounters were catastrophes, but they were also ambushes of a sort. European commanders walked into battle with virtually no understanding of Mongol tactics, logistics, or intelligence networks. Once word spread of what these new foes could do, and once some of the immediate shock wore off, European military culture had the potential to adapt. Stone castles, dense forests, mountains, and a network of relatively autonomous cities offered forms of resistance very different from the open steppe. Even the much maligned feudal levies had strengths the Mongols would have found costly to overcome in a prolonged, continent-wide campaign. So in this video, we're going to follow the Mongols into Europe and then stand with them at the turning point. We'll see what made them so terrifyingly effective, and then we'll walk through the multiple, overlapping reasons, logistical, environmental, political, and strategic why they did not, and in many ways could not, convert those victories into a permanent conquest of Europe. We'll also take a hard look at some of the most persistent myths, that only the death of a great Khan in faraway Mongolia saved Europe, or that medieval Christendom possessed some special military genius that the rest of Eurasia lacked. By the end, you'll see that the answer is not a single dramatic event, but a web of constraints and choices. To understand why the Mongols stopped where they did, we have to place them back into the broader geography of Eurasia, into the realities of horse-based warfare, and into the internal politics of an empire that was already straining under its own size. But before we talk about why they did not conquer Europe, we need to understand why contemporaries thought they could. That means looking at the rise of the Mongol war machine, how a collection of steppe tribes forged an empire from the Yellow Sea to the Black Sea in a single lifetime, and how their methods of warfare exploited the weaknesses of the societies they faced. Because only when you grasp just how formidable they were on their own terms does the real question come into focus. What kind of obstacle is big enough to stop an army like that? After Mohi, the Kingdom of Hungary lay open. King Bela IV fled toward the Adriatic, seeking refuge with allies who suddenly seemed very far away. Mongol detachments fanned out across the Great Hungarian Plain, burning villages, cutting down those who resisted, and driving off herds and captives. Chroniclers record entire districts emptied of their population, and archaeological evidence of widespread destruction confirms that these were not just exaggerations born of trauma. For a few terrible months, the Hungaro-Croatian kingdom ceased to function as a coherent state. Yet if we pause the story here, at the point of maximum Mongol success, we can already glimpse the seeds of their eventual limits. The same features that had made Hungary such a devastating killing ground also made it a kind of cul-de-sac. The Carpathian Arc formed a rough horseshoe of mountains, enclosing the plains in the middle. To get in, the Mongols had forced their way through a series of passes and river valleys, smashing or bypassing the stone fortifications that guarded them. To get further west, they would have to push out again through narrower corridors, leaving their main body increasingly far from the open steppe that had always been their strategic base. Logistics, in this context, did not mean supply trucks and railheads. It meant grass. A typical Mongol warrior might have 3, 4, or even more horses, rotated to preserve their endurance. An army of tens of thousands of men therefore required herds of well over 100,000 animals, all of which needed pasture and water. On the Eurasian steppe, this was manageable. The grasslands were vast, and the Mongols were intimately familiar with their seasonal cycles. In Hungary, the plains initially looked invitingly similar, and in spring and summer, they probably provided excellent grazing. But Western and Central Europe were not a continuous sea of steppe. The further west and south one went, the more the landscape broke up into woods, cultivated fields, and wetter ground. Medieval European agriculture, with its mixture of open field systems, enclosed pastures, and dense forest belts, did not create the same kind of continuous grazing that Mongol herds relied on. In a narrow sense, raiders could live off what they found, slaughtering local livestock and taking grain. But a permanent occupation force and its horses would have been much harder to maintain, especially once the initial shock wore off and local elites began to organize scorched earth defenses. We can see hints of this strain in the campaign of 1241-42 itself. During the winter, the Mongols attempted to cross the frozen Danube to operate in western Hungary and Austria. That they could march in winter at all was one of their great advantages. Yet winter in the Carpathian Basin was harsher and wetter than many of their previous theaters. When an unusually mild spell thawed the rivers and turned lowlands into bogs, large bodies of cavalry risked finding themselves trapped in mud and broken ice. Some historians have suggested that the difficult conditions of the winter of 1241-42 contributed to Batu's decision to pull his forces back east once the main objectives of the campaign had been achieved. Even in regions better suited to horse warfare, sustained Mongol occupation required care. In North China and Transoxiana, they relied heavily on existing irrigation systems and urban tax bases to feed their armies. In Persia and the Caucasus, they alternated between devastating raids and negotiated submission, calculating how much destruction the land could bear without losing its long-term value. Europe west of the Carpathians, with its relatively lower urbanization and fragmented authority, did not promise such easy gains. You could burn a town or two and carry off captives, but extracting steady tribute from a patchwork of lords, bishops, and communes would have been a very different kind of challenge. This is where the physical and political geography started to reinforce each other. The stone castles and walled cities that dotted Central and Western Europe were not uniformly impregnable, especially once the Mongols had access to Chinese and Muslim siege expertise. But they were numerous, often sited on hilltops or riverbends that complicated cavalry operations, and embedded in networks of mutual support. A force moving quickly through such terrain could devastate the countryside, but to truly conquer it would have required time-consuming sieges at dozens, perhaps hundreds, of fortified points. Time, for the Mongols in Europe, was not an unlimited resource. Every campaigning season spent in the West was a season not spent elsewhere. Rivals within the dynasty watched each other carefully, counting who controlled which armies, which pastures, which rich subject cities. When Ogedei, the Great Khan in Karakorum, died in December 1241, the political clock started ticking. Succession in the Mongol Empire required the gathering of princes in a Kurultai, an assembly that made decisions about the next ruler. No one of Batu's rank could simply ignore that obligation without risking his own legitimacy. We will get to that famous recall soon, because it does matter. But it only became decisive in a context where the costs of pushing further into Europe were already high and rising. Batu and his generals were too skilled not to notice that every step westward lengthened their supply lines, narrowed their maneuvering space, and brought them into contact with a landscape full of small, defensible strongpoints rather than open battlefields. The devastation of Hungary showed what they could do at full strength. The nature of Europe beyond it suggested what it would cost to go further. For a commander raised in the unforgiving calculus of steppe warfare, that was not an attractive equation. He could raid, burn, and withdraw with honor and enormous plunder. Could he, at acceptable cost, replace the political structures of all Latin Christendom with a stable Mongol administration? That was a different question entirely, and one that Europe, perhaps without realizing it, was better positioned to answer in the negative than many of the Mongols' earlier victims. To see why that mattered, we have to step back and look at what the Mongols were when they rode into Europe. Not just a horde of horsemen, but a carefully engineered war machine built to exploit very particular kinds of terrain and opponents. Genghis Khan did not invent steppe warfare, but he refined it with a ruthless attention to organization and adaptability. Before his rise, the tribes of Mongolia had fought each other in shifting alliances, their power limited by feuds and fragile loyalties. Through a mixture of charisma, terror, and patronage, Temujin, as he was then known, bound these rival clans into a single confederation and imposed on them a structure that had more in common with a drilled army than a loose tribal levy. The core was the decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, each with appointed commanders who owed their rank to the Khan, not to their birth. This meant that in battle, orders could be relayed and executed with a discipline that astonished their enemies. Combined with the mobility of mounted archers who could fire accurately at full gallop, the result was an army that could perform complex maneuvers, envelopments, feigned retreats, the sudden concentration of force at a scale and speed that sedentary states struggled to match. Intelligence and planning were equally important. Mongol scouts and spies went ahead of the main force, mapping routes, identifying strong points, and gathering information about enemy dispositions long before the first arrows flew. When the Mongols turned this system against their early targets, the Jin dynasty in North China, the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, the kingdoms of the Rus, the results were catastrophic for the defenders. In North China, they learned and refined siegecraft, employing Chinese engineers, Muslim specialists, and terrifying new weapons like early gunpowder bombs and massive trebuchets. Where earlier steppe confederations might have been stymied by walled cities, the Mongols integrated siege trains into their campaigns, moving systematically from field battle to blockade to storm. Against the Khwarezmians, they exploited political divisions and the overconfidence of Shah Muhammad II, drawing his armies into battles where maneuver and missile fire tore them apart before their heavy cavalry could close. In the forests and riverlands of the Rus, the principalities were brave but divided, their princes often more eager to outmaneuver each other than to cooperate fully against the new enemy. The Mongols took full advantage, defeating local forces piecemeal, then besieging and sacking cities like Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev, one by one. These were grim rehearsals for the European campaign. Columns of horse archers probing ahead, heavier contingents and siege equipment following more slowly, the whole army converging at pre-arranged points to apply overwhelming force. What impressed contemporaries was not just the cruelty, though, that was real enough, but the precision. This felt less like a raid and more like a rolling, methodical annihilation. From the perspective of a 13th century European noble hearing rumors from the east, it was natural to assume that what had happened in Rus or Transoxiana could happen just as easily on the Rhine or the Seine. After all, weren't knights and boyars and Persian heavy cavalry all versions of the same armored warrior ideal? If the Mongols could smash one, why not all? But this apparent similarity masked important differences. The Mongols' greatest triumphs to that point had occurred in regions where large, centralized states or loose aristocratic polities alike presented them with either big target cities dependent on surrounding agriculture or clusters of lords whose mutual suspicion made joint resistance difficult. The physical landscape often worked in their favor: steppe, open plain, or wide river valley where cavalry could maneuver. Europe shared some of these features, but not all. Its political fragmentation went deeper, down to a dense layer of local lords and urban communes that could and did act on their own when necessary. Its strongholds were not just a handful of great capitals, but a whole hierarchy of fortifications, from royal bastions to baronial castles to walled market towns. In much of Western and Central Europe, the forest edge and the uplands were never far away. Roads were fewer and worse than in the old Roman days, and in wet seasons they turned into quagmires. To a Mongol planner used to swinging whole tumens around an enemy flank across open country, this was a different kind of chessboard. None of this made the Mongol system obsolete, but it meant that some of its sharpest edges would have been blunted. Feigned retreat, for example, depended on drawing an incautious enemy out into the open, then wheeling to shower them with arrows and encircle them. It had worked spectacularly at the Battle of the Kulka River in 1223 against a coalition of Rus's princes and steppe allies, and again at Mohi and Legnica. Yet European commanders who survived or received detailed reports of such defeats could, in theory, learn from them. A knight who had seen comrades annihilated while pursuing fleeing horsemen might be more cautious next time, especially if operating close to a friendly fortress whose walls could shelter a steady, more patient defense. There is a real contrast here between the almost laboratory-like conditions of early Mongol victories and the messy potential of a prolonged European campaign. Against the Khwarezmian Empire, the Mongols faced a ruler who executed their envoys and reacted with prideful fury, committing his main forces without fully understanding his opponent. Against many of the Rus's principalities, they confronted fragmented coalitions that failed to coordinate. In Europe, the early battles likewise reflected surprise and ignorance. But unlike in Khwarezm or northern China, there was no single capital whose fall would automatically collapse the whole region into Mongol hands. Paris, Rome, and Cologne were important, but France could still exist without Paris, and the papacy had already fled Rome more than once in its history. This is not to romanticize European resistance. In 1241, most rulers beyond the disaster zones reacted slowly and often selfishly. But structurally, the terrain of both politics and geography did not line up as neatly with Mongol strengths as other theaters had done. And as their empire expanded, the Mongols themselves were changing. What had begun as a highly mobile confederation of warriors increasingly had to think like administrators, tax collectors, and imperial statesmen. The very success of their system created new vulnerabilities, rival branches of the royal family, debates over succession, and tensions between those who favored further conquests and those more interested in consolidating the lands already taken. It was at this intersection between a military system optimized for rapid campaigns, a continent that required slow, grinding sieges, and an empire whose political center of gravity lay thousands of kilometers away, that the prospects for a Mongol conquest of Europe began to break down. The famous story goes like this. Europe was saved by a death in a distant capital. In December 1241, far away on the upper Orkhon River in Mongolia, the Great Khan Ogedei drank himself to death. According to many later chroniclers, this single event forced Batu and his generals to break off their victorious march and hurry back east to take part in the election of a new supreme ruler. Strip out the drama, and there is a core of truth here. The Mongol political system did, in principle, require the major princes to attend a Kurultai to choose the next Khan. No one, not even the conqueror of half a continent, could afford to look like a rebel or a usurper. But if we look more closely at the sequence of events, the picture becomes more nuanced. Batu did not wheel his tumans around the very day the news arrived. The winter of 1241-42 saw continued Mongol operations in western Hungary, Croatia, and along the Danube. Only in the spring did the bulk of the forces begin to withdraw through the Carpathian passes and back across the devastated plains. Moreover, not all the princes actually rushed home. Batu himself delayed and later used his distance from the heartland to resist the election of his rival Guyuk. Internal politics mattered, but they interacted with military realities rather than simply overriding them. From the European side, the sense of reprieve was profound. Pope Innocent IV sent letters to rulers across Christendom calling for information about the Tatar threat and dispatched envoys eastward, both to spy and, if possible, to negotiate. Local chronicles from Austria and Bohemia speak of fortifications hastily repaired, militias drilled, and refugees crowded into walled towns. Some writers clearly believed that only divine intervention, perhaps expressed through the Khan's death, had turned away a disaster no human effort could have averted. Yet even as they thanked God, the more pragmatic among Europe's elites began to take stock of what the Mongol campaign had revealed about their own vulnerabilities. Hungary offers a striking example of that learning process. King Bela IV, whose realm had been smashed in 1241, spent the next decades undertaking what historians sometimes call a program of refoundation. He encouraged the construction of stone castles and fortified towns on a scale that earlier Hungarian kings had largely neglected, granted privileges to settlers willing to defend frontier zones, and reorganized royal authority in ways meant to prevent such a collapse from happening again. If a comparable Mongol invasion had pushed into Hungary in, say, the 1,270 seconds rather than the 1,240 seconds, it would have faced a landscape bristling with new strongpoints rather than a relatively open plain dotted with only a handful of stone fortresses. The same pattern, in milder form, played out elsewhere. News of Mongol tactics, of their reliance on speed and open maneuver, and of the terror they inflicted on undefended rural populations, spread with the refugees. Lords who had once neglected their walls now saw the value of thick stone and deep ditches. Cities that had enjoyed autonomy under distant kings asserted their right to organize defenses, raise militias, and negotiate with potential attackers. Even if Europe never forged the kind of unified coalition that modern strategists sometimes imagine, it possessed many localized centers of decision-making. A conqueror who wanted to impose a single, stable regime would have had to break, suborn, or accommodate each of them. From the Mongol perspective, this meant that every year of delay would have raised the price of any renewed push. Castle building and military adaptation could not turn French or German knights into perfect anti-Mongol warriors overnight, but they could slowly convert the landscape into a hedgehog bristling with points that hurt to step on. And the Mongols, for all their destructiveness, were not indifferent to cost. They had already learned, in their long and brutal struggle against the Song dynasty in southern China, how draining siege warfare could be when conducted across broken, river-crossed terrain. To repeat that experience on yet another distant front, for the sake of relatively poor and politically fragmented lands, was far from an obvious choice. Internal priorities pushed in the same direction. After Ogedei's death, the empire's elite fractured into camps. Batu, ruling over the newly subjugated western steppes, and the Rus, had his own interests. The Ogedei line wanted to preserve its claim to supreme power. Other princes schemed to advance the fortunes of their branch of the family. In this environment, committing large forces to sustained operations in Europe without clear, immediate payoffs carried real political risk. Every tumen tied down near the Rhine was a tumen that could not be used in China, in the Middle East, or in the inner power struggles around Karakorum. It is telling that when the Mongols did resume major Western campaigns later in the 13th century, their focus was not on pushing deep into Latin Christendom, but on consolidating control over the Middle East and the Caucasus. Hulagu's invasion toppled the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in 1258 and overran much of Syria, but even then, the ultimate limits of Mongol arms were exposed. In 1260, at Ain Jalut in Palestine, a Mamluk army defeated a Mongol detachment, exploiting similar constraints of distance, logistics, and overextension that would have troubled a renewed drive into Europe. Once again, the problem was not that Mongol horsemen had suddenly become less brave or less skilled, but that the ecological and political conditions necessary for their style of empire building were no longer aligned in their favor. Contrast that with their eastern frontiers. In North China, the rich farmlands, dense urban networks, and long tradition of imperial bureaucracy provided a tremendous tax base once conquered. In Persia and Iraq, controlling the crossroads of trade routes and irrigated agriculture meant that a single successful campaign could bring enduring wealth. Europe offered no equivalent of the Grand Canal or the Tigris-Euphrates heartland. Its riches were more diffusely distributed, its political authority more granular. From a cold strategic standpoint, the energy required to break it and hold it down might yield less than the same effort spent elsewhere. This does not mean Europe was inherently unconquerable, or that some mystical Western exceptionalism protected it. Had the Mongols been unified, determined, and willing to accept very high costs, they could probably have inflicted even more extensive destruction, perhaps even imposed tribute on some kingdoms. But the historical situation in the 1240s and 1250s made that level of commitment unlikely. A single twist of fate in Mongolia did not save Europe in isolation. Rather, Ogedei's death intersected with geography, climate, fortification patterns, and imperial politics to nudge decision-makers like Batu away from further risky adventures in the far west. Seen from this angle, the real story is less about miraculous escape and more about mutual limits. The Mongols had pushed their model of conquest close to its natural boundaries. Europe had suffered terribly at the contact point, but also revealed structures, physical and institutional, that made full incorporation into a nomadic-founded empire a difficult proposition. The frightening ease with which Mongol armies had smashed field forces in 1241 was real, but it was only one part of a much larger strategic equation. Those structures were not romantic abstractions. They were made of stone, wood, law, and habit. At ground level, what a Mongol scout or commander would have encountered west of the Carpathians was a mosaic of jurisdictions. Bishoprics whose lands lay inside, but also outside kingdoms, abbeys with their own fortified precincts, independent or semi-independent cities, and castles whose lords owed shifting layers of fealty. Breaking any one of these units was within Mongol capability. Breaking enough of them, over a wide enough area, to replace them with their own administrative mesh was something else entirely. In Hungary and the Rus principalities, the first wave of conquest had shown a pattern that might have been repeated in parts of Europe. Initial devastation, followed by the submission of surviving elites and the extraction of tribute. Russian princes who recognized Mongol overlordship kept their thrones as vassals, traveling to the Khan's court to receive formal charters of authority and paying dearly for the privilege. In the Caucasus, Armenian and Georgian rulers did much the same. These systems worked because there were relatively clear dynasties to co-opt, and because the Mongol presence nearby was permanent enough to enforce their will. West of the Elbe, the picture was fuzzier. Who, exactly, was the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire in a way that would satisfy a Mongol demand for submission. The emperor in theory, but powerful dukes and bishops in practice. In northern Italy, rival communes waged vendettas under the banners of Guelph and Ghibelline. In France and England, kings were certainly real powers, but their ability to collect taxes, conscript men, and impose decisions was patchy and often contested. A Mongol embassy demanding that the Lord of the Franks or the Lord of the English come in person to the Khan's court might be met with something more slippery than simple refusal. Jurisdictional argument, deferral, or an offer to negotiate on narrower terms. The church added another layer of complexity. In the Islamic world and in China, the Mongols could tap into existing bureaucracies and religious elites as long as those elites were willing to live under new masters. In Latin Christendom, the papacy claimed universal spiritual authority, often in explicit opposition to secular rulers. To bow formally to a non-Christian overlord would have raised profound theological problems for kings who legitimated their rule through anointment and sacral ritual. That did not make submission impossible. There were always pragmatists, but it made quiet vassalage on the Georgian model harder to imagine on a continental scale. The same institution that fragmented secular power could stiffen resistance on questions of ultimate allegiance. Economically too, Europe posed difficulties. The Mongol fiscal apparatus, where it functioned best, plugged into dense webs of trade and agriculture. China's granaries and canals, Iran's irrigated fields, and Central Asia's caravan networks yielded predictable streams of revenue once brought under control. Medieval Europe was not poor, but its wealth was more thinly spread. Urban centers like Venice, Milan, or Flanders were lucrative, yet they were relatively small nodes in a countryside of modest market towns and manorial estates. To milk this landscape efficiently required either devolving collection almost entirely to local lords who might underreport and resist, or building an expensive new bureaucracy from scratch, far from the Mongol heartlands. All of this helps explain why the Mongols, when they thought about Europe, so often did so in terms of raids, punitive expeditions, or demands for formal submission, rather than as a core zone of empire to be integrated like North China. European envoys such as John of Plano Carpini and William of Rubruck, who reached the Mongol courts in the 1240 seconds and 1250 seconds, reported back that the Khan's primary expectation was not religious conversion or cultural assimilation, but obedience and tribute. Yet they also noted the distance, literal and figurative, between European polities and the main axes of Mongol interest. Rubruck's detailed account of his travels in the Western Steppe reads less like a prelude to imminent conquest and more like a reconnaissance mission whose results convinced at least some Europeans that the Tatars were not invincible. Gods, but men with their own limits. On the military side, adaptation had already begun. Crossbows, which had played a role in earlier battles against Muslim and Byzantine foes, offered a way to reply to mounted archers with heavy, armor-piercing bolts from behind fortifications. Infantry formations armed with spears or early pikes could, if properly led, deny cavalry the decisive shock of a charge. None of this erased the Mongol advantage in open maneuver, but it shifted the balance in sieges and defended river crossings. The experience of facing or hearing about the invaders' composite bows, encirclement tactics, and feigned flights would, over time, have filtered into European tactical thinking in the same way that the Crusades had reshaped methods of warfare 2 generations earlier. It is also easy to forget the maritime dimension. The Mongol Empire was overwhelmingly a land power, although it did sponsor fleets in East Asia later on. Western Europe, by contrast, contained seafaring societies above all in the North Sea and Mediterranean zones. That could maintain links, move troops, and, if necessary, evacuate elites by water. A Mongol force that had somehow penetrated to the Atlantic coast would still have faced enemies able to sustain resistance from islands, peninsulas, and coastal strongholds beyond the immediate reach of steppe cavalry. That did not make Europe safe, but it complicated the pattern of total encirclement that the Mongols had achieved around cities like Baghdad or Kaifeng. History gives us a glimpse of how these various factors might have played out in practice in the form of the so-called Second Mongol Invasion of Hungary and Poland in the late 13th century. By then, the western part of the empire had fractured into khanates, and internal rivalries further reduced the scale and coherence of their campaigns. Yet when Nogai and Talabuga led forces into Central Europe in the 1282, they did not find the same easy prey as their predecessors. Hungarian fortifications were stronger, local forces more experienced, and the element of total surprise gone. The result was a far less decisive series of operations, with some successful raids, but no repeat of the catastrophe of 1241. Those later campaigns were smaller and more tentative than Batu's Great Invasion, and we should not read too much into them. Still, they underline that time did not stand still on the European side. The window during which a massive, coordinated Mongol assault might have rolled deep into the continent with minimal preparation from its defenders was relatively narrow. Once closed, it would have required an even greater commitment of manpower, resources, and political will to force it open again. And by that point, the Khans had other concerns: rivals in their own family, rebellions in subject lands, and the enormous task of ruling what they already held. All of this brings us back to the counterfactual so often posed: could the Mongols have conquered Europe if they had really tried? We can sharpen that question now. Could a unified Mongol leadership, choosing to prioritize Europe over China or the Middle East, and prepared to bear heavy short-term losses for uncertain long-term gain, have imposed their rule over most of Latin Christendom? The answer is, perhaps in some form, but at costs and on terms very different from their earlier conquests. They might have extracted tribute from certain kingdoms or installed client rulers in some regions. They were far less likely, given all we have seen, to have turned Europe into another North China or Iran, a stable, central tax base of their empire. Understanding why highlights something important about both sides. The Mongols were not stopped by a single miracle or a single general. Their power hit a zone where its core advantages met diminishing returns. Europe, for its part, was not saved by inherent superiority, but by a combination of contingency, geography, institutional structure, and learning under fire. That near miss, and the stories later told about it, would shape European self-perceptions for centuries, feeding ideas of chosenness, resilience, and distinctiveness that have little to do with how a Mongol general in 1241 would have calculated his options. Looking back across 8 centuries, it is tempting to smooth all of this into a neat story with a clear moral. In one version, Europe faces an unstoppable Asiatic tide, saved only by a lucky death and divine providence. In another, a supposedly superior Western way of war proves itself even against the greatest nomad empire in history. At the same time, stripping away the comforting myths is no reason to invert the story and romanticize Europe instead. The initial performance of many European rulers in the face of the Mongol threat was sluggish and divided. Crusading energies remained fixated on the Holy Land, even as the real existential danger approached from the northeast. Christian armies at Legnica and Mohi were annihilated in battles where their commanders did not yet understand what they were up against. Had Batu chosen to keep pressing in 1242, more such disasters were certainly possible, especially on the open ground of northern Germany or the plains of northern Italy. There was nothing genetically or culturally pre-programmed that guaranteed successful resistance. What did exist were structures that could, under pressure, adapt and reconfigure. Fortifications could be strengthened, local militias could be drilled, information could move along monastic, commercial, and diplomatic networks, spreading not only fear, but also practical lessons about the invaders' methods. The Church could justify resistance in spiritual as well as worldly terms. Lords who rarely agreed on anything could at least grasp that a power which demanded their personal submission to a distant Khan threatened the social order they lived by. These were not insurmountable obstacles for a determined conqueror, but they were obstacles, and they multiplied the further west a Mongol war council traced its arrows on the map. That is why the most realistic answer to the question, "Why could the Mongols not conquer Europe?" is not a single causative bullet point, but an accumulation of frictions. Geography limited how far large cavalry forces could operate without prohibitive cost. Climate and pasture cycles set hard bounds on sustainable campaigning. Political fragmentation made quick decapitation impossible, while at the same time making slow consolidation excruciating. Internal Mongol succession crises and rivalries encouraged commanders like Batu to bank their gains rather than gamble on more distant, more demanding ventures. On the European side, learning, fortification, and institutional stubbornness gradually raised the price of further incursions. Seen from the smoking fields of Hungary in 1241, none of this was obvious. To the peasants fleeing west, to the monks writing in trembling script about the horsemen from beyond the known world, it felt as though history itself had broken. Yet from the vantage point of the wider Eurasian system, the Mongol advance into Europe looks less like an opening of infinite possibility and more like one prong of a vast, overextended spear probing its own limits. It drove deep, then met enough resistance from nature, from distance, from human arrangements that further thrusts no longer made sense. In that sense, Europe's narrow escape tells us as much about the logic of empires as it does about medieval Christendom. No power, however formidable, can expand indefinitely without confronting environments, societies, and political constraints that it was not designed to master. The Mongols reached that point on several frontiers almost at once, and Europe happened to be one of them. Understanding this does not diminish their achievements or the suffering they inflicted. It simply sets them in a more realistic frame. It also reminds us that the histories we inherit of salvation, of superiority, of inevitable triumph, are often built on the contingent choices of people far away, facing calculations they themselves might have struggled to articulate fully.